The email arrived at 6:14 on a Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary notification I get dozens of times a week in my line of work. A new shared match flagged in a genealogy database I've used professionally for 11 years. I almost didn't open it before my coffee finished brewing. My phone had buzzed twice already that morning with other case updates, a distant cousin match for a client working on an unknown parentage case in another state, a routine maintenance alert from the lab I contract with, the kind of background noise that makes up most of my professional life and rarely, if ever, demands my attention before I've had a full cup of coffee in my hand. I'm glad, now, that something made me open it anyway, standing barefoot in my kitchen with the pot still gurgling behind me, because the moment I saw the relationship estimate at the top of that report, I felt the floor tilt beneath me in a way I hadn't felt in exactly 10 years. Parent-child match. 3,485 centimorgans shared. Estimated relationship. Mother and daughter. I stood there staring at a name I didn't recognize, attached to a DNA kit uploaded 8 days earlier by a woman helping her 10-year-old daughter with a school genealogy project, and I felt something in my chest go completely, permanently still, because I had buried my daughter 10 years ago, and I had spent every day since believing that grief was the one thing in my life I understood with absolute, unshakable certainty. I read the report 3 times standing at that counter, my coffee finally finished and going cold behind me, untouched because some part of me understood, even in that first disorienting minute, that whatever I did next was going to reshape everything I'd spent a decade believing about the worst day of my life. My name is Naomi Calloway. I'm 39 years old, and for the last 11 years I have worked as a forensic genetic genealogist, the kind of work most people only hear about when a true crime documentary mentions that a decades-old cold case was finally solved through a DNA database rather than traditional police work. I build family trees out of genetic fragments. I take a stranger's raw DNA data and trace it backward through generations of shared ancestry until I find the specific branch where 2 lives intersect, the biological parent an adoptee never knew, the half-sibling separated by a closed adoption decades earlier. Occasionally, in the darker cases I've worked alongside law enforcement, the identity of a person who never wanted to be found at all. I built my entire career on trusting genetic evidence over every other kind of story a person might tell you about who they are. I never once imagined I would need those exact skills to investigate my own life. I came to this work sideways the way a lot of people in my field do. I started as a hobbyist in my 20s, building out my own family tree during a slow year between jobs, and I discovered, almost by accident, that I had a genuine talent for the kind of patient, layered cross-referencing the work required, holding a dozen shifting variables in my head at once. A birth year here, a migration record there, a shared surname that might mean everything or might mean nothing at all. A colleague eventually recommended me for a case involving an unidentified set of remains a county coroner's office had been sitting on for nearly a decade, and I found the family within 6 weeks using nothing but public genealogy databases and the same stubborn patience I'd first practiced on my own ancestry. That first case taught me something I've carried into every one since, that patience isn't the absence of urgency, it's simply urgency disciplined enough to wait for proof before it acts. I've built a career on that patience ever since, working with adoptees searching for birth parents, with law enforcement agencies chasing cold cases gone cold for lack of any other lead, with ordinary families simply trying to understand where they came from. I built my entire professional identity around a single, unshakable belief that the truth, however long it takes to surface, is always worth finding, and that the people who deserve it most are usually the ones who have waited longest. 10 years ago, I gave birth to a daughter I named Iris, 6 weeks premature, delivered at a small birthing center 40 minutes outside the city called Willow Creek Midwifery, a place I'd chosen specifically because I wanted a quieter, more intimate birth experience than the hospital I'd been referred to, and because the midwife who ran it, a woman named Marlene Petrie, had come recommended by 3 different friends who swore by her calm, steady presence during their own deliveries. My labor was long and complicated, hours longer than anyone expected, and somewhere in the final stretch of it, exhausted and half delirious with pain, I remember Marlene's face going very still, the particular stillness of someone trying not to let panic show. I remember being told, once it was finally over, that my daughter hadn't survived, that complications during delivery had been too severe, that I wouldn't be able to hold her, that it would be easier. Marlene said gently if I let them handle everything from there. I never saw her. I want to say that plainly because it matters to everything that came after. I never held my daughter, never saw her face, never got the small, cruel mercy some grieving mothers describe of at least having a single photograph to hold on to. I remember asking, in the haze of exhaustion and blood loss right after, whether I could see her for even a moment, and I remember Marlene's hand on my shoulder, gentle and firm at once, telling me it would only make things harder, that some mothers found it easier not to. I believed her completely, the way you believe anyone standing over you in a moment when you have no strength left to question what you're being told. I was handed a small wooden box 11 days later, told it contained her ashes, and I buried that box in a corner of my parents' property beneath a young maple tree, and for 10 years, I visited that tree every single year on the anniversary of her birth, believing, with the same absolute certainty I brought to every genetic case I'd ever worked, that I was visiting the only physical trace my daughter had left behind in the world. I sat at my kitchen table that Tuesday morning with my coffee going cold beside me, staring at a match report that suggested everything I had believed for 10 years was a lie, and I did the only thing I knew how to do with information that's significant. I started building the tree. I want to explain something about how this work actually functions, because it matters to understanding exactly how careful I had to be over the following weeks. A DNA match doesn't lie. People lie. Records get falsified, memories shift, grief reshapes a story into something easier to carry, but the genetic data itself, shared centimorgans, chromosome overlap, the mathematical signature of a specific biological relationship, doesn't care what anyone remembers or wants to be true. I had built my entire career on that fact. I had told dozens of clients over the years, gently, carefully, that the DNA doesn't lie even when everyone around them has been lying for decades. I understood, sitting at that table, that I was about to have to extend myself the exact same brutal honesty I'd extended to strangers for 11 years. The match had come through under a username I didn't recognize, uploaded from a kit purchased through a consumer testing service, associated with a public tree that listed the daughter's first name as Charlotte and gave her birth year, though not the exact date, as 10 years earlier. I sat with that information for a long time before I let myself do anything else, because I have learned, across 11 years of this work, that the temptation to reach a conclusion too quickly is the single most dangerous instinct in genetic genealogy, and I needed to be certain, methodically, painstakingly certain, before I let myself feel a single thing about what I was looking at. I spent the first 3 days doing what I always do with a new case, building out the shared match list, the network of more distant relatives who also appeared connected to this profile, looking for the pattern that would either confirm or unravel what the top-line estimate suggested. I barely slept those 3 nights, working at my kitchen table with the same 3 browser tabs open I use for every case, a chromosome mapping tool, a shared match spreadsheet, and a blank family tree template I filled in slowly, cautiously, refusing to let myself draw a single line I couldn't fully support with data. I called it Case 447 in my own private notes, the way I number every file, because giving it a case number instead of a name was the only way I found to keep my hands steady enough to actually do the work correctly. Nearly every distant match on Charlotte's list traced back, through careful cross-referencing, to branches of my own extended family, a second cousin on my mother's side, a set of third cousins descended from my grandfather's brother, the kind of overlapping genetic web that simply doesn't happen by coincidence. I checked the numbers against every alternative explanation I could think of, a half-sibling I didn't know existed, a more distant relative whose shared centimorgan count might have been miscalculated by the algorithm, an aunt or a first cousin who could plausibly share this much DNA under a different relationship model. None of the alternatives held up against the data. By the 4th day, I had built enough of the tree to know, with the same professional certainty I'd bring to testimony in a courtroom, that Charlotte was not a distant relative. She was my daughter, biologically, unmistakably, the child I had buried in a wooden box beneath a maple tree 10 years earlier. I didn't cry when I finally accepted it. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a different reaction than the one I actually had. I sat very still at my kitchen table, The same stillness I remembered from the moment Marlene Petrie's face had gone quiet in that delivery room 10 years earlier, and I felt something colder than grief settle into my chest, the particular, focused clarity that has carried me through every difficult case I've ever worked. If my daughter was alive, then everything I had been told 10 years ago was a fabrication, and someone, somewhere, had made a very deliberate decision to let me bury an empty box and grieve a lie for an entire decade. I called my sister, Delia, before I called anyone else because I needed someone who had actually been there 10 years ago, who had sat with me in that hospital room afterward, who had helped me choose the small maple tree we'd planted. She was quiet for a long time on the phone after I explained everything, and when she finally spoke, her voice was unsteady in a way I'd rarely heard from her. "Naomi," she said, "are you completely sure? I need you to be completely sure before either of us says another word about this out loud." "I built the tree the same way I'd build it for any client," I told her. "I checked it 4 times. This isn't a distant cousin showing up as a false positive, Delia. The shared centimorgan count is a parent-child match. There's no other explanation that fits the data." She was quiet again, and I could hear her moving around her kitchen, the small domestic sounds of someone trying to steady herself with something ordinary while the ground shifted underneath an entirely different conversation. "I keep thinking about that week," she finally said. "How strange it all felt, even at the time, and I never let myself examine why. Marlene wouldn't let anyone else into the room during the last hour. She wouldn't let Mom see the baby afterward, even for a minute, even though Mom asked twice. I told myself that was just how it worked sometimes, complications, hospital policy, whatever reason made sense at the time. I never once let myself wonder if there was a different reason. None of us had any way to know," I said, though I understood, even as I said it, that some part of both of us would spend a long time afterward quietly relitigating every small, strange detail we'd once explained away. "Marlene retired from Willow Creek about 6 years ago," Delia said. "I ran into her once at the farmer's market, maybe 2 years back. She wouldn't really look at me. I thought it was strange at the time, but I didn't think anything more of it. Now, I don't know what to think. I hadn't spoken to Marlene Petrie in a decade, not since the week after Iris's death, when she'd come to my parents' house once, briefly, to offer condolences I remembered as warm and genuine at the time. I found her address through public records within an hour, a small house 2 counties over, and I sat with the decision for 2 full days before I finally drove out there, because I understood, even then, that whatever I was about to hear was going to change the shape of everything I thought I knew about the worst day of my life. She answered the door herself, older than I remembered, her hair fully gray now, and I watched her face when she recognized me, watched something behind her eyes go still in exactly the way I imagine my own face must have looked reading that match report a week earlier. "Naomi," she said quietly, "I wondered some days if this would ever happen." I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I had spent a week building a case with the same rigor I bring to every piece of forensic work I've ever done, and I wasn't going to let a decade of practiced grief soften the questions I needed answered. "I found her," I said. "My daughter. She's alive, Marlene. She's 10 years old, and somebody has been raising her for a decade while I buried an empty box in my parents' backyard. I need you to tell me exactly what happened." She didn't argue. She didn't ask for proof, didn't question how I could possibly know, and something about the immediate, resigned way she stepped back from the doorway to let me in told me she had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time, maybe longer than the 2 years since my sister had seen her wordlessly avoiding eye contact at a farmer's market. We sat in her small kitchen, a kettle she never got around to using cooling on the stove behind her, and she was quiet for a long moment before she finally spoke, her hands wrapped tightly around each other on the table. "I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest," she said. "What I did was wrong. I've known it was wrong every single day for 10 years, and I want to be honest with you about all of it, even the parts that don't make me look any better than I deserve to look." "Tell me," I said. She told me that Willow Creek Midwifery hadn't simply been a small, independent birthing center the way I'd always believed. It had been founded and quietly controlled by a man named Gerald Hux, a former hospital administrator who had lost his license years earlier after a licensing board investigation into irregular adoption placements at a hospital he'd overseen, and who had rebuilt, under a different name, in a different county, an operation that did essentially the same thing without the oversight a hospital would have required. Willow Creek accepted mothers, Marlene explained, mothers who were young, or struggling financially, or facing complicated pregnancies that made a hospital birth feel frightening and expensive, mothers who trusted the warm, personal environment Marlene herself had genuinely believed in when she first started working there. What those mothers didn't know was that Gerald Hux had built a second, quieter business alongside the legitimate midwifery practice, arranging private, off-the-books infant placements with affluent families willing to pay substantial sums to bypass the years-long wait times and rigorous screening of legal adoption in exchange for a single, devastating lie told to the biological mother in the delivery room. He targeted specific cases, Marlene said, her voice breaking slightly. Complicated deliveries, especially ones where the mother had lost a lot of blood, was exhausted, wasn't in a state to ask too many immediate questions. He'd tell me, sometimes just an hour or two before it happened, that we had a family waiting, that the payment had already been arranged, that all I needed to do was tell the mother the delivery hadn't survived and handle the paperwork the way he'd trained me to handle it. I want you to know I didn't do this easily, Naomi. I fought him on it more than once. But he had leverage over me, financial leverage, threats about my own license, and I told myself, God help me, that the babies were going to good homes, that the families waiting for them genuinely wanted them, that somehow that made it less monstrous than it actually was. What kind of leverage? I asked, because I wanted the whole picture, not the version that made her own choices easiest to explain. She looked down at her hands. I'd made a mistake early in my career, before Willow Creek, a medication error at a hospital I'd worked at that I'd managed to keep quiet at the time through a settlement neither side ever spoke about publicly. Gerald found out about it somehow. I still don't know exactly how, and he made it clear, without ever saying it outright, that my silence about his arrangement was the price of his silence about mine. I've spent 10 years telling myself that explains what I did. It doesn't excuse it. I understood that the moment I said yes the first time, and I understood it every single time after that too. You told me my daughter was dead, I said, and I heard my own voice come out steadier than I expected, though something underneath it had gone entirely cold. You handed me a box of ashes that belonged to no one. You let me bury an empty box and grieve a real child for 10 years. I know, she said. I have known every single day. I retired from Willow Creek 4 years ago, partly because I couldn't keep doing it, partly because Gerald Hux's operation finally started attracting the kind of attention that made continuing too dangerous for both of us. I never told anyone what we'd done, not out of loyalty to him, but because I didn't know how to undo it without destroying every family involved, including yours, including whatever family your daughter had grown up believing was entirely her own. I sat with that for a long moment, the kettle behind her finally beginning to whistle softly, neither of us moving to silence it. How many? I finally asked. How many babies? I don't know the exact number, she said quietly. I stopped counting at some point because counting made it real in a way I couldn't survive facing directly. More than a dozen, over about 6 years, before I finally refused to continue, and he found someone else willing to take my place. Why now? I asked. Why not come forward the day you finally stopped? She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally answered, her voice had gone very small. Cowardice, mostly. I told myself I'd already done enough damage, that coming forward would only multiply the number of families whose lives I destroyed instead of quietly containing it to the ones I couldn't undo. I understand now that was never really about protecting anyone, but myself. I'm sorry, Naomi. I know it doesn't come close to enough, but I am sorry, and I'll say whatever needs saying to whoever needs to hear it, if it helps make any of this right for you and for her. I drove home that evening with the radio off, the silence in the car feeling less like emptiness and more like a kind of held breath, because I understood, driving past the exit that would have taken me to my parents' house, to the maple tree I had visited every year on an anniversary that had apparently meant nothing at all, that I was no longer simply a grieving mother who had just found an impossible answer. Whether I wanted the role or not, the one person in this entire situation with the exact professional skill required to find every other family Gerald Hux had done this to. I called Marcus Webb the next morning, a family law attorney I'd worked alongside twice before on legitimate adoption reunion cases, someone I trusted precisely because he'd never once treated my genetic findings as anything less than serious evidence, even in cases far less explosive than this one. He was quiet for a long time after I finished explaining everything, and when he finally spoke, his voice had the careful, measured quality I remembered from our previous cases together. "I want to walk through this in stages," he said, "because what you're describing touches several different legal categories at once: illegal adoption placement, falsification of vital records, potential fraud against the adoptive families themselves if they weren't told the truth about how the child came to them, and depending on how deliberate the delivery room deception was, potentially something closer to trafficking. We need to move carefully, and we need to move in a way that protects Charlotte first, before anything else. I'm not trying to tear a 10-year-old girl's entire life apart overnight," I said. "I understand she has parents. Whatever else is true, she has a family who has raised her for a decade, and I'm not walking into her life like a stranger demanding she suddenly belong to me instead." "That's exactly the right instinct," Marcus said. "And it's going to matter enormously for how a court eventually views your intentions here, if it comes to that. Right now, the most important thing is documentation. I want everything from your genetic analysis formally reviewed by an independent lab for legal purposes, and I want to find out everything we can about the adoptive family before either of you approaches them directly. If they knew this was an illegal placement, that's one conversation. If they were deceived just as thoroughly as you were, told they were completing a legitimate private adoption, that's an entirely different one, and it changes how carefully we need to handle this." He recommended a second lab, one accredited specifically for legal and forensic use rather than the consumer database Charlotte's kit had come through, and I spent the better part of a week walking a technician there through the same analysis I'd already completed myself, watching her arrive, independently, at exactly the conclusion I already knew was coming. There was something strange about sitting on the other side of that process for once, the client instead of the analyst, watching someone else explain shared centimorgan thresholds and relationship probability charts to me as though I hadn't spent 11 years explaining the exact same concepts to grieving, hopeful strangers myself. It took Marcus's investigator less than 2 weeks to identify Charlotte's adoptive parents, a couple named Grace and Thomas Whitfield, living just under 3 hours away, a family with no other children, no history of legal trouble, a paper trail showing they had paid a substantial private adoption fee to a facilitator connected loosely to Gerald Hux's network a decade earlier, believing, as far as every document suggested, that they were completing an entirely legal, if unusually expedited, private adoption of a newborn whose birth mother had voluntarily relinquished her. Marcus reviewed everything the investigator found line by line before he'd let me see any of it. Wanting to be certain, he said, that we approached the Whitfields with facts rather than assumptions, given how much was already riding on getting this next part right. I want to be honest about how strange those 2 weeks felt, working a case that was simultaneously the most personal thing I had ever investigated and, professionally, almost identical to a dozen other reunion cases I'd handled for strangers over the years. I found myself, more than once, having to stop and remind myself that the 10-year-old girl at the center of this particular family tree wasn't a client's long-lost relative. She was my daughter, growing up under a name I hadn't chosen, in a house I'd never seen, believing, as far as anyone could tell, that the family raising her was the only family she had ever had. I kept a case file open on my desk the entire time, the same way I would for any client, and some nights I caught myself staring at it long after I should have closed my laptop, unable to fully separate the professional distance I'd trained myself to maintain for 11 years from the simple, overwhelming fact that this particular file contained my own daughter's entire hidden childhood. Marcus arranged the first conversation with the Whitfields carefully, through a mediator experienced in exactly this kind of delicate reunion, someone trained to help adoptive families process news this destabilizing without immediately spiraling into fear or defensiveness. I wasn't in the room for that first call. I sat in Marcus's office instead, waiting, the same particular stillness I'd carried for 2 weeks settling over me while somewhere else in the city, Grace and Thomas Whitfield learned, for the first time, that the adoption they believed was entirely legitimate had actually involved a falsified death certificate and a mother who had spent 10 years grieving a child who was, in fact, growing up 3 hours away as their own daughter. Grace Whitfield called me herself 2 days later, her voice shaking through the entire conversation, and the first thing she said to me, before anything else, was that she was so deeply sorry that she and Thomas had believed, completely and without question, that they were giving a home to a baby whose birth mother had chosen adoption freely, that they had paid the fees they were told to pay because that was simply how private adoption worked in the version of events the facilitator had presented to them, that they had never once imagined, in 10 years of raising Charlotte, that somewhere else a mother was visiting an empty grave. "I don't know what happens next," she said, and I could hear her crying quietly on the other end of the line. "I don't know what's fair to ask of you, or of us, or most of all of her. I just need you to know that we love her. Whatever else is true, we love her completely, and I understand if that doesn't matter to you right now, given everything that was taken from you. It matters," I told her, and I meant it, because I had spent 2 weeks bracing myself for a very different kind of conversation, one where I might have to fight two people who'd known exactly what they were buying and simply hadn't cared. "I'm not here to take her away from the only home she's ever known. I need you to understand that clearly right now before we talk about anything else. I want the truth to exist, finally, after 10 years of it not existing. What happens after that, I think, has to be something we figure out slowly, together, with her needs at the center of it, not mine and not yours." We talked for nearly 2 hours that first call, carefully, both of us picking our way through a conversation neither of us had ever imagined needing to have, and by the end of it, Grace had asked, gently, whether I would be willing to meet with her and Thomas in person before anything was said to Charlotte at all, so the three of us could agree together on how, and when, and how much a 10-year-old should be told about a truth this enormous. I agreed immediately, grateful, more than I could easily put into words, that the family raising my daughter was made up of people willing to move this carefully rather than people who needed to be forced into it by a court order. The legal process that followed took nearly 5 months, careful and deliberate in a way that felt, at times, unbearably slow and, at other times, exactly as slow as it needed to be. Marcus worked alongside the Whitfields' own attorney, a calm, thorough woman named Priscilla Ortiz who I came to respect enormously over those months, to establish a framework that didn't disrupt Charlotte's legal standing with the only parent she'd ever known, while formally, permanently establishing my biological relationship to her and, more importantly to me by that point, formally documenting exactly what had happened 10 years earlier so that the falsified death certificate sitting in a county records office somewhere could finally be corrected to reflect the truth. We met 4 times over those months, the 4 adults involved, sitting together in Marcus's conference room working through questions none of us had ever expected to face, how visits would begin, how slowly, what Charlotte would be told, and when, how to build something honest without building something that overwhelmed a child who had done nothing except exist inside a lie none of us had told her. Gerald Hux was still alive, still living 2 counties over from where Willow Creek had once operated, and the case Marcus eventually helped build against him, working alongside a state investigator named Renata Ford, who took the file seriously the moment she understood its scope, uncovered 11 other families over 6 years who had unknowingly adopted children through falsified stillbirth reports, alongside 4 birth mothers, myself included, who had spent years grieving children who had never actually died. Marlene testified against him in exchange for limited immunity, her own culpability weighed carefully against the fact that she had, in the end, been the only person who ever gave any of us the truth at all, even a decade late, even imperfectly. Investigator Ford told me once, near the end of the process, that cases like this one almost never come to light without someone inside the operation eventually breaking their own silence, and that whatever else was true about the harm Marlene had caused, her decision to finally tell me the truth had been the single thread that unraveled the entire scheme for every other family still living inside it. I sat in on part of Gerald Hux's preliminary hearing myself, near the back of a courtroom I had once only ever entered professionally, as the person explaining genetic evidence to a judge rather than the person whose own life had produced it. Watching him sit at the defense table, composed and unbothered in a way that struck me as almost unbearable given everything I now knew about what he'd built, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself feel until that moment, that the calm, methodical work I'd done tracing Charlotte's family tree had never really been separate from the work I'd spent 11 years doing for strangers. It had simply finally come home to the one case I could never have predicted needing to solve. I met Charlotte for the first time on a warm afternoon in early autumn, 5 months after that first email had arrived in my inbox, in a quiet park the mediator had suggested as neutral, comfortable ground. Grace and Thomas came with her, sitting a short distance away on a bench, close enough to be present, far enough to let the moment belong mostly to the two of us. She was taller than I'd pictured, with a serious, careful way of studying my face that felt, immediately and almost unbearably, familiar, the same way I remember studying strangers' faces as a child, looking for information no one had thought to give me directly. She wore her hair in a single braid over one shoulder, and she carried a small canvas bag she set down carefully beside her on the grass, the particular deliberate care of a child who has learned to treat her own belongings gently. "They told me your name is Naomi," she said, sitting down on the grass across from me, cautious but not afraid. "And that you're like a detective, but for family trees." Something like that, I said, and I felt something in my chest finally loosen just slightly for the first time in 5 months. I find people who are lost to each other. I just never expected to find someone quite this close to home. She was quiet for a moment, picking at the grass between us, and then she asked the question I'd been bracing myself for since Marcus first arranged the meeting. "Are you sad that I don't remember you?" Because I don't. I don't remember anything before Mom and Dad. I thought about that question carefully before I answered because I understood, even in that first conversation, that how I handled the next several years of her life mattered infinitely more than how I handled the next several minutes. "I'm not sad about that," I told her honestly. "I'm glad you had 2 people who loved you every single day, even before either of us knew the truth about how you came to them. I just wanted the chance to know you too, in whatever way makes sense for you, for as long as you want that." She nodded slowly, the particular solemn nod of a 10-year-old working through something too large for the words she currently has available, and then she asked if I wanted to see a drawing she'd made that morning, and I said yes, and for the next 20 minutes we sat together on the grass while she showed me a sketchbook full of horses and half-finished maps of imaginary islands, each one labeled in careful, uneven handwriting, explaining the rules of a made-up kingdom she'd apparently been building for months. I understood, watching her explain each one with the same careful, methodical seriousness I recognized instantly from my own childhood, that whatever came next between us didn't need to be resolved that afternoon. It only needed to begin honestly, which was more than either of us had been given for the previous 10 years. Before Grace and Thomas took her home that first afternoon, Charlotte turned back once, walking backward a few steps across the grass, and asked if I would come again next week. I told her yes, and I watched her run the rest of the way back to the bench where her parents were waiting, and I sat alone in that park for a long time afterward, feeling something I hadn't let myself feel fully in 10 years. Not the sharp grief I'd carried to a maple tree every year, but something quieter and stranger underneath it. The particular disorientation of finally exhaling after a decade of holding your breath without ever fully realizing you'd been doing it. The second visit went easier than the first, and the third easier still, each one adding a small, ordinary detail to the picture I was slowly building of a daughter I hadn't known existed 6 months earlier, that she loved horses more than almost anything, that she was learning to play violin and hated practicing scales, that she had Thomas's stubborn streak and, according to Grace, my exact same habit of going quiet and still when she was working through a problem she didn't yet have words for. I found myself, some weeks, simply watching her from across a park bench or a kitchen table, cataloging small resemblances the way I might catalog genetic markers in any other case, except this time each small match landed somewhere far deeper than professional curiosity ever had before. The relationship that's grown since then hasn't followed any single, clean shape. Charlotte calls me Naomi, not Mom, and I've never once asked her to consider otherwise, because Grace and Thomas earned that word from her one ordinary day at a time for 10 years, in a way that no DNA match, however undeniable, could ever retroactively claim. I see her most weekends now, sometimes with Grace and Thomas present, increasingly on our own as she's grown more comfortable, and I've learned, slowly, to hold something I never expected to need to hold at all, a relationship with a daughter I love completely and a family that isn't mine, raising a child who is. There are still awkward moments, evenings when I catch myself reaching for a familiarity I haven't actually earned yet, birthdays where I'm not entirely sure whether my presence is a gift or an intrusion into a celebration that belonged, for 9 years running, to exactly 3 people instead of 4. I've learned to ask, plainly, when I'm unsure, rather than assuming, because I understand now, more clearly than I ever did in 11 years of professional reunions, that the technical fact of biology and the earned, daily fact of family are related but never identical things, and that the space between them is where the real work of any relationship like ours actually happens. Grace and I talk on the phone most weeks now too, careful, honest conversations that started out stiff and uncertain and have grown, gradually, into something that occasionally, unexpectedly, resembles friendship. 2 women who share a daughter in the strangest, most complicated way either of us could have imagined, choosing, deliberately, to build something functional out of a situation that could just as easily have destroyed all of us instead. I planted a second maple tree this spring, at my own house this time, not to replace the one still standing in my parents' backyard, but because I wanted something living and growing that belonged to the truth instead of the decade of lies I'd unknowingly tended in its place. I still visit the first tree sometimes. I've stopped thinking of it as a grave. I think of it now as a marker of everything that was taken from me for 10 years, and everything I finally, carefully, got the chance to build back, piece by piece, the exact same way I've built 100 family trees for strangers who trusted me to find them the truth, no matter how long it took or how much it eventually cost to hear it. Marlene Petrie's case is still moving through the courts as I record this, alongside Gerald Hux's, and I've been in contact, gently and carefully, with 3 of the other birth mothers investigators identified through his network, women who are only now, years later, learning that the children they buried never actually existed as the empty boxes they lowered into the ground. One of them, a woman named Corinne, called me in tears the first time we spoke, telling me she'd spent 9 years believing she'd somehow failed her own body, carrying a private, silent guilt she'd never told anyone the full shape of, and that hearing my case had finally, at long last, given her the courage to request her own daughter's records. I've offered each of these women the same thing I eventually gave myself, patient, careful, methodical proof, built the same way I've built it for 11 years, one verified connection at a time, because I understand now, more than I ever did before that Tuesday morning email, that the truth doesn't actually need permission to exist. It only needs someone patient enough and skilled enough and finally brave enough to go looking for it directly. I think sometimes about the version of that morning where I might have simply closed the email without opening it, told myself it was nothing, gone about an ordinary Tuesday the way I had gone about thousands of ordinary days before it. I understand now how easily that could have happened, how close I came to letting 11 years of professional instinct override the simple, human impulse that finally made me open a match report I almost dismissed without a second thought. I've stopped taking that instinct for granted since then, in my own life and in every case I take on afterward, because I know now, in a way I only understood theoretically before, exactly how much can be quietly, permanently lost in the space of a single unopened email. If you'd received that email 10 years after burying your own child, I wonder what you would have done, whether you'd have opened it standing barefoot in your kitchen the way I did, or whether some part of you might have been too afraid to look. I'd love to know what you think happens for Naomi and Charlotte in the years ahead, whether you think the careful, patient relationship they're building slowly becomes something closer, or whether you think what they already have, honest and unhurried, is exactly enough as it is. I think about that question myself some evenings, sitting under the new maple tree in my own backyard, and I still don't have a single, tidy answer. Maybe that's the truest thing I can tell you about any of this. Some stories don't end so much as they simply keep being lived, one honest, ordinary Saturday afternoon at a time. Leave a comment, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I love hearing from all of you. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going.